So I think we can start as we usually start on time. Welcome everyone to the EGPP seminar series, today's session. I see some familiar faces, I see new faces. My name is Lars-Erik Cederman and I lead the EGPP seminar series and I will be chairing today. We have almost weekly sessions, always on Wednesday between 12:30 and 2 p.m. And the EGPP seminar series brings together various types of seminars. And today's seminar is a research seminar. In the last weeks, we were able to revert to a hybrid mode, but today, unfortunately, we're back fully online. I have no doubt it will be nonetheless be an exciting and engaging sessions since we had very positive experiences in the past, and hopefully we will be back in hybrid mode from next week onwards. And we're very fortunate to have Lars-Erik Cederman with us today online, although we would have much preferred to have him here in Florence, and I'm very happy to welcome him and thank him for agreeing to give today's seminar. Lars-Erik Cederman is professor at ETH Zurich, and he will present a paper on nationality problems and war, revisiting the Macedonian Syndrome. So in terms of format, Lars-Erik will speak about 40 minutes. We're not super strict about it, and then we will go straight to Q&A. For the audience, I think you know how it works by now. Please keep your mics muted, but the video on if you can. Thank you very much, everyone, for being with us, especially to Lars-Erik. Lars-Erik, I give you the floor. If you would like to share the screen, you're welcome to do so. Thank you.
Yes, well, thanks so much for the invitation. Let me see if I can get this up and running here. Perfect.
Looking good.
You can see it well, or? Very good. First of all, thanks so much for the invitation. It's really too bad that my son tested positive when we were about to take off, only 24 hours before I realized that, so we had to change things. The good news is that my son is doing fine. It was more like a cold. That's so that's the good news, but the bad news is that I can't be down in Florence. In fact, the view of the Duomo from here in Uetikon in Switzerland is a bit obstructed by two mountain chains, so it's not quite the same thing. And I was hoping to revive my experiences of the Negroni, but I will probably have to resort to mixing them myself just for the time being. But the good news is also that I will be coming back. Jeff Checkle was kind enough to invite me. So I will be coming in June, on June the 22nd. So we'll be able to recover from this mishap. And in fact, I think this is going to be a rather nice sequel to the current paper. So the paper I'm giving then is the follow-up paper to this paper. So I schedule things this way. In fact, this is all coming out of an ERC project, the NASDAQ project that we've been working on in my group here at ETH for a few years. And this is one of several papers. What I'll tell you about today is something that has emerged in collaboration with Yannick Pengel, Dennis Atzenhofer, and Luc Jardin, and the co-authors are in fact present at the in the session. So if I get really tricky questions, I will refer to them, obviously. Now, nationality problems and war, that sounds a bit dry and academic, but it's obviously rather topical. Here, I couldn't resist the temptation of showing this, especially since Biden has said that the attack might happen today. So it couldn't be more hot than that. So the good news is that there may actually be some de-escalation going on, but we're not really certain about that. Now, this is not just a dispute between two countries in traditional IR style. This is obviously something that involves the Russian speakers in Ukraine and very much a nationality problem. So this is case in point for the current presentation. Now, the collapse of the USSR, of course, cleaned up the map in many respects. Many nationalities that had belonged to the former Soviet Union got liberated, but the Russians were split. And as you know, there is a considerable Russian-speaking minority inside Ukraine, and it's really about them when it comes to the nationality problem. Okay, so what can we do in order to understand situations of this type? Well, one of the most interesting and complex features of this is that it's not just about interstate conflict, and it's not just about civil war, but it's about both at the same time. And that's where the literature is not very helpful, because the scholars tend to talk about one or the other, but very rarely about both at the same time. But to get the full complexity of situations like this, we need to dig more deeply into the literature. And I would argue that it's really Myron Weiner's classic article from 1971 in World Politics, The Macedonian Syndrome, that offers the best guidance here. So we're going to piggyback on his insights here, but in order to see how far this carries us, we need to test his ideas and to systematize them, contextualize them in a way that would allow for more wide-ranging evaluation, empirically speaking. Now, this calls for major data collection, and that's what the NASDAQ project has been up to. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about data on state borders, data on ethnicity, historical data going back to 1816 in terms of the states and ethnicity starting in the 19th century. And we also have data that we're using from 1946 for the entire globe. Now, what we find here is that, yes, Myron Weiner travels. His Macedonian syndrome does apply to more than the handful cases that he looked at for inspiration. And we find that irredentist configurations do trigger both civil and interstate wars. And there is this interactive effect between these two types of conflict. However, the results, although not entirely absent, are a bit more mixed when we start to look beyond Europe during the post-World War II period. Now, just a few words about this famous article. I'm sure you've seen it before. It's one of the favorite assignments on my reading lists when I teach conflict research, because it's one of these pieces that fall precisely at the intersection between comparative and IR, the way that I prefer to teach, because I don't think that if you look at almost any problem that we are interested in terms of conflict research, there is almost never a case where it's enough to look at either IR or comparative. It's almost always necessary to try to bridge the gap. And that's why it's really a pioneering effort that Myron Weiner did when he launched this project. And what he did was essentially to study the rest of the world that is rather, I should say, the developing countries, the countries that had become independent in the 50s and 60s. And he realized that he didn't have enough data. It was very difficult to figure out what would happen. And that's when he thought that just analogies, historical analogies, are not enough. So what he did was to create a dynamic historical model, a qualitative model, if there is anything like that. It's quite surprising, perhaps, to many political scientists today. When you say model, you think it's going to be a game theoretic model. No, it's a descriptive dynamic model that charts out in an ideal typical way with moving parts in a sequence, how with specific actors, what type of outcomes are likely. So it's not just the outcomes, it's also the process that's really interesting to Myron Weiner. Now, he focused on the Balkans because he thought that if he was going to find an area within Europe where the literature is more established and you have a longer stretch of recorded history and analyzed history, the Balkans will be the closest approximation of many of the third world cases that he was interested in. So you had things like imperial domination, weak and multi-ethnic states exposed to great power, rivalries and influence. So some of the ingredients were there for a valid comparison. So what Myron Weiner did was, in fact, to diagnose the problem like a doctor would do it. So he would describe the symptoms and the pattern of these symptoms in order to come up with a syndrome. Now, what he found was quite important. I mean, one of the most important insights is that the key actors are in a triad. So you have typically this combination of an irredentist state, an anti-status quo neighbor, and a shared ethnic group that is divided by the state border between these two states. So you have the combination of, in other words, a split ethnic group and some type of claims, territorial claims. So the boundaries are not uncontested. So it's precisely this interaction between the internal and the external conflict that is explosive. So then Myron Weiner proceeded to come up with this story, more of a sequential story with great power competition and alignments that then triggered conflict inside the status quo state, where the minority that with kin abroad in the irredentist state would be coming under pressure from the defending state. And so you have the climate of fear and paranoia and suspicion, very emotional, with lots of tension building up with accusations and claims and risk-taking in terms of foreign policy. So I don't have time to get into the details here, but I think you've probably even seen this paper before, but you get a spiral that could lead to both internal and international conflict, and for that matter, also one-sided violence, but that's not what we're looking at here. So what about the out-of-sample prediction? Well, I would say that indeed, the former Yugoslavia in the early 90s is a case in point. That's where the literature is trying to pick this up. Rogers Brubaker writes quite prominently in 1996 in his Nationalism Reframed book, and he reinvents the triad without first citing Myron Weiner, which is rather ironic. And unfortunately, Brubaker, although he writes beautifully, he is more interested in meta theory, and he gets stuck in this idea that you can't talk about groups. And then what he does in that book, or in that chapter about the triad, is that he does talk about groups. So he talks about groups without admitting that he's talking about groups, which is not very helpful. Now, of course, he's brilliant as a sociologist, but he's also not really interested in developing the link to conflict. That's not his priority, unlike Myron Weiner. So there we don't really get ahead. And some of the people who have been looking at conflict in the former Yugoslavia, for instance, would be like people like Barry Posen, many people who just don't get the triadic nexus. They they do away with the states and look at groups doing things, and that's not very helpful either. So what you have typically when people get into irredentism more explicitly is either, as I said before, people who look at how nationality problems may trigger interstate war, or how nationality problems trigger civil war. So it's either or, but almost never both at the same time. So you have a prominent literature in international relations that look at different configurations, minority, majority, dyads, etc. And there is quite a lot of interesting results here that resemble Myron Weiner's more sophisticated theory, but this is partial. And the same thing applies to the civil war side of the equation, where I've been active myself doing research more within the civil war paradigm. And here again, we find strong indications that it really does matter if you have ethnic groups on the other side of the border. So you need to go to an open polity model away from the closed polity model in order to get a better handle on the dynamics of conflict. Now, there is obviously, it's very often not enough that you just have a kin group on the other side. Various power configurations would have to be there, etc. So it's a little bit more complicated. But by and large, this confirms many of Myron Weiner's expectations. Now, when it comes to the literature that tries to straddle this divide between interstate and civil war, there you have much less. So we have Cunningham and Lemke in a piece in International Organization from 2013, and they just throw the cases of interstate and civil war into one big sample and derive coefficients and compare the coefficients of either part of the sample and say, oh, it looks about the same. But that's not obviously theoretically very helpful for our purposes. So perhaps the piece that is the most helpful is Gleditsch, Salian, and Schultz from 2008 in the Journal of Conflict Resolution, where they in fact find a strong indication looking at the outbreak of MIDS, militarized interstate disputes, that civil war in any of these countries involved would tend to have an effect. So they argue that intervention, externalization, and spillover are various mechanisms that could lead to this. And they even get into irredentism, but not very deeply. So this is an interesting and important study that just shows that there is something, but there's only in one direction, from civil war to interstate war. So we try to go beyond that. There is also a recent paper in IO by Edry et al. 2021 on threats at home and abroad. But that's more about alliance patterns rather than full-fledged conflict. Okay, so what can we do in order to get beyond this rather fragmented picture in the literature? So what we're trying to do here is to look at the basics of nationalism, not just ethnicity. It's really about the principles of political legitimacy in the international system and how it shifted from the time of the French Revolution, from territorial to popular sovereignty. As you know, in dynastic times, sovereignty was not vested in the people, but in the sovereign, and was descending. So whoever happened to be the king was running the show, and as soon as popular sovereignty showed up, the descending arrow of legitimacy was flipped. So now suddenly the people became the locus of sovereignty. And very soon, this popular sovereignty notion had to be somehow operationalized. And it turns out that it was a nation that very often the politicized ethnic community that was de facto serving as the demos in most cases around the world, but certainly starting in Europe in the 19th century. And this has been described brilliantly by Brubaker in 1992 and Bernard Jack in 2002, etc. Now, what this means, as soon as the nation shows up as this locus of sovereignty, is that nationalism becomes absolutely decisive. And you have a normative foundation based on the state-nation congruence that Gellner classically defines on page 1 of his famous book from 1983. So as soon as the state and the nation overlap perfectly, as soon as they are congruent, we have no problem. But deviations from this congruence means trouble. This is a scandal. This is poison to the nationalists. And you have two types of deviations, as Gellner also points out already on page 1. You have the classic notion of alien rule, where like doesn't rule like. So in other words, you have, for instance, in empires, ethnically distinctive rulers that, so say, oppress you, as it were. And division is the other violation. Here, you may actually be running your own show, but you're not unified with your nationalists, your co-nationalists, as was the case in the early 19th century in Germany and Italy, for instance. And then you have combinations of alien rule and division, and that's exactly what irredentism is about. So what Gellner sketches briefly on page 1 is that there will be tensions, and exactly how this then leads to violent conflict is something that Gellner doesn't get into himself. In fact, Mark Beisinger has written about conflict and the collapse of the former Soviet Union, is arguing that one of the problems is that Gellner is talking more about nationalisms that bark rather than nationalisms that bite. And we're really into the biting part here now. And what does this look like? Well, here is our attempt to systematically chart out the possibilities that you get from these two types of violations of nationalism. So along the vertical axis here, you have the whole story of home rule, and horizontally you have the dimension of unity versus division. So we are looking at the vantage point of the group itself, and the gray shaded areas are the ethno-nationalist groups. The stars are the capitals, where the power is vested, and the boxes are the state borders. Now, from the vantage point of the gray areas, that is the ethno-nationalist groups, then you can be either enjoying home rule or alien rule, but you can also have a mix. If one segment, one part of the ethnic group is in power in one state, whereas the opposite applies in the other state, then you have a mixed situation of partial home rule. And then, but this obviously cannot happen if you only have one state with one segment. So that's why we don't show this possibility. That's why you have this white area here. So this is the first starting point. This is the nation state. So in this case, you have the Gellner's congruence. And the prediction in terms of conflict would be that there would be no conflict due to nationality problems. And obviously, nation states could fight other nation states in interstate warfare, but that's not due to nationality problems. That's because nationalism may actually lead to more mobilization and more intense warfare, etc. But that's not what we're interested in here. So if you look at alien rule, however, this is a classic situation of liberation fighting inside an empire, for instance. Here you have many cases like the Baltic peoples that were conquered by the Soviets. In 1946, they fought back, for instance, rebellion, and you have many, many other cases like this. Now, if we move to division, however, this would be a situation where you have, for instance, two principalities in Germany fighting it out, or two states, even the, you could say, Prussia versus the Habsburg Empire led by the Germans, even fought a war. So there could be competition in an integration process. This may not be quite as, to say, likely, however, because presumably these guys would be able to integrate peacefully. You have the situation under D, today represented perhaps by the Kurds, where you have possible rebellion in states, in neighboring states, where no segment is really in power. Now, the Macedonian syndrome in its full complexity is represented by this configuration C. And that's where you have partial home rule combined with division. And the red arrows here, by the way, I should say, of course, are the conflict predictions that we make. And in this case, you could have, in case B, you could have a competition between the two capitals or the two segments in an interstate dispute. And here you only have, according to the nationality logic, rebellions. What's interesting about this combination C is precisely that you have possible interstate conflict together with intrastate conflict or rebellion. And that is, of course, something that is exactly what this irredentist configuration is about. And there are quite a few cases. In fact, we could say that this is like the current situation in Ukraine. So if you have a situation of the Russians here, we should have flipped them geographically, and now we have Russia on the wrong side, but anyway. So if this is Moscow, here are the gray guys here are the Russians or ethnic Russians, and they are rebelling inside Ukraine if this is Kiev, and there is a possible, and there have been conflicts between the two states in the past, and that's what we are looking at. Here are all the tanks, Russian tanks lined up right now today. Okay, so, but there are many more cases of this. Obviously, the Greeks in the Ottoman Empire, and you have enduring rivalries here. Here we can now set up hypotheses and start to test all this. And what's interesting is that we're not just interested in the specific arrows, but also how the two arrows relate to each other. So we call it H12C. That's to what extent the civil war may be triggering interstate conflict. So how basically this arrow here may make this arrow more likely, and vice versa. So that's where we get this two-level logic. So I should watch out so I'm not running out of time, but we can, if you have questions, we can come back to this. I need to move a little bit more quickly here, but we're getting into the state borders and essentially how we are going to be able to operationalize all this. And so a few words on the data now. Essentially what you do need would be data on state borders and ethnicity in order to say, get on top of all these nationality problems from an operational standpoint. And the state borders we have operationalized, we have at two levels. We have a global sample from 1886 to 2017 that we are going to use for a global follow-up study. And then we had to do a fair amount of new coding going back to 1816 in Europe. And we piggybacked a bit on the Centennia Atlas and tried to backdate C-shapes in this way. The even trickier is, of course, to get on top of the whole ethnic landscape. And this is notoriously difficult. And some people would even argue you can't do it. I mean, Brubaker would probably hate this idea of even trying to identify groups, but we do so based on ethnic maps, historical ethnic maps. And the way we do it is that we collect all these maps, we scan them, geocode them, and then we obviously have to select those maps that are of high resolution, high quality, with enough coverage, geographically speaking. And we also have to make sure that we don't have obviously politically biased maps, because many of these, or some of these maps, I should say, are part of the nationality process itself. Okay, so we can come back to the details of this, and then you have to align these things quite carefully because there are different levels of ethnicity, and we have ways to overcome that by tracing everything back to ethnologue, the linguistic atlas, and then we break it down to pixels and let the map layers vote. And based on that whole aggregation process, as you can see here, you have the Hungarians before World War II, you get a polygon, an area that we think is the best guess, where the Hungarians really were settled. And then on top of that, you also have to add conflict data, of course. And here we had to take the cow and leadage data on civil wars going back to 1816, where more modern data, where we have done a fair amount of data collection ourselves. And we break this down to ethnic segments now. So the conflict in terms of internal conflict or civil conflict is now linked to the segments, to the ethnic segments. And at the interstate level, we can, it's a little bit easier because there are ready to be used data sets, both on territorial claims and militarized interstate disputes starting in 1816 in both cases. And we use these to test the interstate conflict patterns. Okay, so let me now show you the results. So here is the first table looking at civil war onset from 1816 for the European sample. And what we get is, say, first of all, I should say, of course, that we have OLS models here with fixed effects of various types, and this is indicated here. We have stricter models here with even with country fixed effects and border duration fixed effects, slightly different configurations for these different models. And we have here the unit of analysis, the ethnic segment. And it's also important to keep in mind that we do not include the dominant segments here because they are not supposed to rebel against themselves. So that means that we can only test the territorial balance here between the segment compared to the dominant segment in the country. And the stronger so we can't really test whether you have alien rule only at this level of analysis, but you can test whether you have a stronger ethnic segment in terms of demography. And this seems to vindicate these hypotheses H1, A, C, and D. But the specific configurations that we're really interested in, H1C here, that's where we get the strong result, but also for the Kurdish type of configuration. Interestingly enough, we also get some signal here for the two-level interaction where past interstate trouble here operationalized as a count of the number of years that you had either an interstate claim or an interstate dispute running involving the kin state of the segment in question. So all this is pointing toward a confirmatory picture, and we have some effects here. I don't have time to get into the details of this, but this is about the standard deviation shift in this territorial balance that leads to this type of effect as and here's one, here's 0, and this is the so to say increase of conflict probability as in relation to the sample mean. And as you can see that there is a fair amount of, I mean, these effects are significant in many of these cases. And this is a little bit more modest, but still significant. But this also depends, of course, on the particular way we count previous trouble. Okay, so the interstate level yields interesting results that are also in support of the Macedonian story. The pure unification logic with home rule on both sides, that's not really, because here, by the way, I should say that the unit of analysis is no longer segments. Here we have state dyads, and we take all state dyads from 1816 until 2002 and record one for a claim, a territorial claim by state A vis-a-vis state B. So these are directed dyads. And here again, we have similar setups in terms of fixed effects. And even in the stricter models, we get some indication that this irredentist configuration in itself is, say, more conflictual than the baseline, and we get the strong indication that past Civil War activity inside the inside state A is in fact no. Let me see now, so I get this right. Inside state B, where the irredentist state A is attacking state B, the host state, that seems to be very much in line with our expectations. And again, we get relatively clear effects here. The unification story doesn't pan out as expected, but relatively clear effects. And we repeat all this for militarized interstate disputes as well, to see how whether action beyond claims would actually make a difference in a very similar setup with just a different dependent variable. And the pattern is somewhat similar. They're slightly more uncertain, but still some interesting results here that seem to be all in all in confirmation of the Macedonian syndrome within Europe. That is obviously going beyond the Balkans, the very strict sample that Myron Weiner was focusing on, and looking at Europe as a whole, and until today also for that matter. Okay, so we also started doing work here on the global sample and to see if Myron Weiner's Macedonian syndrome travels beyond Europe. And here we are restricting the sample to the post-World War II period, only independent states and segments therein, using EPR, ethnic power relations data that we have produced ourselves, with a slight twist that the, so to say, dominant group here is not just a completely in a monopoly situation, can be in a power sharing position as well, but has to be the senior and the largest group in the country. And we get some signals here that indicate there may be something. This result gets a little bit stronger if we switch on all civil wars instead of just territorial civil wars. So this is a somewhat weak result for the irredentist configuration C. Configuration D, the Kurdish situation, seems to be very robustly linked to conflict. And we get rather weak results for the two-level dynamic, whereby past trouble in interstate trouble would lead to civil war. So here are the effects, and we get fairly robust results when it comes to the configuration for territorial claims in the dyadic setup in exactly the same configuration as in Europe. But interestingly enough, there is a negative result for the two-level interaction based on past civil war. And we get very weak results finally essentially nothing significant, everything smeared out a bit for the militarized interstate disputes. And there are different, we can talk about why this is so, but we do think that in the environment post 1945, it is very likely that norms, international norms, put a damper on adventurous activities. In fact, what Putin is up to here with his saber rattling on the border of Ukraine is very much exceptional, which is the reason why we are also shocked. So it could well be that this is, if that tendency were to continue with Taiwan, etc., we may actually get back to the good old days of irredentist nationalism, a la Myron Weiner and the Macedonian Syndrome. It would be nice for the significance of the model, but not so nice for us living in this world. So let's hope that does not happen. So I don't have time to get into robustness, but we did all sorts of things already, and a little bit more can be done, perhaps using population instead of territorial surfaces, and looking at all conflicts instead of just territorial ones, and looking at restricting the sample to territorial neighbors instead of dice. It doesn't make that much of a difference in most cases. And so let me, since I'm running out of time here, let me just wrap things up and say that we do think that the Macedonian Syndrome holds to Europe as a whole. And there are cases well outside this very narrow region, although most of the cases are actually, interestingly enough, located in that region. But certainly the Russian Empire and its successor entities have also produced a huge number of cases. And what we find is that this irredentist configuration is indeed driving both civil and interstate war, and that there is an interaction between the two as predicted by the model, but mostly in the direction from civil war to interstate war. That's a more robust result, but there is some signal in the other direction. The evidence, as we've seen for the entire world, is more mixed, though the irredentist configuration for interstate territorial claims seems to fall into exactly this category of what is to be expected, but we need to do a little bit more work on this to be absolutely certain where we stand on that. And there's plenty of room for future research, but instead of talking about that now, I think we should I should just mention one major follow-up here that we have not touched on, and this is what could be labeled as a restorative nationalism, and this is how past configurations may actually influence the likelihood of conflict. And that we haven't looked at here, but Myron Weiner actually mentions this, and that's the topic, The Future is History, we call that paper, Restorative Nationalism and Conflict in Post-Napoleonic Europe. That's the sequel that you may actually enjoy, perhaps even seeing me present in person on June the 22nd. So stay tuned on that, but let's talk about this paper first. So thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you, Lars-Erik. Thank you very much for a fascinating presentation and paper. So now the floor is open for Q&A, comments, questions. We don't have discussions, we go straight to Q&A. Who would like to? Simon Hicks, you go ahead.
Yeah, let me go first because I've got to run. I had about 10 minutes, I'm afraid. But Lars-Erik, this is really fabulous work. I love the great historical sweep as well as the combination of data and theory. One of the questions or problems I have had with a lot of the nationalism research when it goes from theory to data is the coding of ethnic groups. And isn't there a danger of an endogeneity problem here, in that we notice ethnic groups when those ethnic groups are problematic, and we don't notice them when they're not problematic? So is there a way you can, in your measurement, is there a way you can nuance that in terms of different thresholds you might use And I don't know the nationalism research enough in your own research. Have you used your own different kind of thresholds in what you are then defining as an ethno-linguistic group? I didn't see that included in your robustness test, but I wonder whether, particularly when we export this outside Europe, we're kind of exporting a European conception of an ethno-linguistic group to the rest of the world. And I wonder whether thinking differently about how you might identify and measure it beyond the European context might allow you to test it more robustly outside Europe.
Yeah, this is a very good point and a serious concern, of course. Partly, and we're also very much familiar with this complication when it comes to the more recent periods of history where we have used the ethnic power relations data set. And a number of people have claimed that that type of coding is endogenous, and there's always a risk at this level. Now, when it comes to the more modern coding that we got into, we tested everything with AMAR. This is the old MAR coding that Joanna Birner and others set up. And we can replicate all our results with that. So we think that there is a concern, but it's very often overstated because these entities are much more durable and robust than many of the hyper-constructivists argue today. There is a lot of radical constructivism floating around, and that is, for specific cases, absolutely legitimate. And we're not denying that this type of inverse causation may actually happen, even at the level of creation of the units that we're looking at. But we think it's overall overstated. And it could be that, of course, the constructor or the originators of these ethnic maps were only interested in the really contentious cases. But we find that relatively unlikely because there's a fair amount of professionalism among the geographers who pioneered these maps. So they were more encyclopedic in their interest, more folkloristic, rather than being interested in biasing the results of some particular treaty. So it's a simplification, a radical simplification, to think that there's all political and they were all, drawing maps willy-nilly. There was a fair amount of professionalism among these guys if you start to look into how these maps were created in the first place. But more should be done at this level. So I agree, whatever we can, and comparisons to more modern ethnicity outside Europe may be helpful. So it's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you. Martin Fink is next.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks, Lars-Erik. A great paper, and I really appreciate indeed the large historical and geographical scope. So a question about the various models that you do. First of all, to make sure that I understand it correctly, but also to hear maybe some ideas that you have about what might explain this. So first, a comment, I find it a bit tricky to compare across these models because your first models are country models, whereas your latter models are dyadic models, right? So that I find a little bit tricky, and it would maybe be interesting to hear something about whether you think this Macedonian syndrome argument is really in nature dyadic primarily, or whether it doesn't have to be dyadic as such. But when I look at your findings, I understand that the division and partial rule results are the crucial ones for that argument. And I do find you're saying that generally we find the same, but if I look at the paper, I wasn't really sure. So just to clarify this. So first of all, on claims, on the dyadic models, claims versus MID. Right, so I see that you find for territorial claims as dependent variable, you find consistent results of your division and partial rule in Europe and globally. Right? So that's interesting. But for the MID, actually you find for that variable, if that's the crucial one indeed, insignificant or barely significant at the 0.10 level results, both in Europe and globally. So it seems that there is something, and they're also less, so we have large standard errors there, right? So they are less precisely estimated. So first question, what's going on in the difference between claims and MID, militarized versus not? And then for the country level analysis, the Civil War onset, you find a clear effect for division and partial rule in the European analysis, but not in the global analysis. So there seems to be something specific, if I read your results correctly, with the European context vis-a-vis the global. So just to push you a bit on what your interpretation of this is. Thanks.
Well, thank you. These are all excellent questions, and I have to confess, of course, that this is still work in progress. In fact, this was the very first time we presented the paper at all. So this type of questions are very important to help us be clear about how far the results carry us. Now, I think that you need to use both research designs, both the monadic segment-based research design for the intrastate conflict cases, and the dyadic one is the most natural one for the interstate story. So that seems quite intuitive, and you need both in the same paper in order to capture both. But obviously, it is possible to pick up, for instance, on the interstate dynamic based on the segment-based coding. So you could code each segment and see if your state is involved in a conflict that is relevant to this irredentist configuration. So it's possible, I mean, we have done some work along these lines, and it would, as I make it a little bit easier for the reader not having to shift from from one unit of analysis to another one. But we still think that this is the most intuitive story. Obviously, it would be possible also to do grid cells and all sorts of other types of research designs, but we think that's less helpful in this particular case. Now, when it comes to the data on the dyadic conflict data, first, the territorial claims are generally probably of better quality. So we think that there is, and we should say more about this in the paper, obviously we haven't had the time to do so, but it seems that if I have to put my hand in the fire here, I would probably put more credence on the territorial claims than the MIDs. Now, in both cases, we get relatively obvious cases that pop up, so they are both plausible, but there is a considerable amount of measurement error involved, especially in the MIDs. There is also a problem at the level of the country coding of civil conflict. And here we've had to limit ourselves to the cow list of civil wars, and which is very restricted, and we're probably missing a lot of action. So we think that it could be that the results are actually stronger if one were to launch into a huge data collection effort that will create a data set that's like Uppsala from 25 battle bets for Europe 1816 until today. But that was outside even the generous EU ERC budget constraint. So we have not been able to do that. So I think there are some question marks here that need to be more carefully discussed, and we're obviously not done with the validation of all these. So if Yannick and Dennis, if you want to add anything to my remarks on this, please do so. Yannick, did you want to?
Yeah, no, just maybe to follow up on the question, how to make sense of these differences between the European kind of most likely case and the global sample post-45. I think one thing that's going on is change of international norms against interstate invasions and troubles of territorial sovereignty and the like, and the multilateral security system post-45. And at the same time, in many of the relevant cases most likely Africa and Southeast Asia, you also had more complex ethno-demographic constellations, and not only demographically, but also politically. You rarely had this European constellation of one demographic and politically powerful group and a host of minorities around it. You often had more balanced demographic and political distributions, and that doesn't translate as straightforwardly into the irredentist logic as it did in Europe, where you, for example, had the Hungarians in Hungary and a Romanian minority, where it was pretty clear who was the dominant group and who had links to another state close by.
Okay. Thank you very much. There is the possibility also to ask questions through the chat if your connection is a bit unstable. Now I see one, but I'm not sure I can interpret. Maybe you can be more explicit in your question. Since I don't see other hands raised for the moment, can I maybe ask something, Lars-Erik, if you allow? So you have two terms in your title, nationality problems and war, and maybe you can clarify a point or two about each of them. So what are these nationality problems? What is it that triggers war? Because I mean, my feeling is, I mean, I don't want to go into too much, too far from too general question, but not all Macedonian scenarios are syndromes. I mean, a Macedonian syndrome seems to be already a conflict, but you could very well imagine scenarios that are Macedonians without being conflictual at all. I mean, maybe, I don't know if it's a case that would fit this, but Ticino in Switzerland is a scenario like that. And there seems to be no problem there for the moment, at least. I mean, but it seems to be no problem. So what are these problems? Is it how these ethnic groups define themselves? Do they see themselves as ethnic groups? Is it a matter of the type of nationality, a more citizenship type of nation, like the Swiss one, or as opposed to a more communitarian one? So why is there no problem? And maybe it depends on definition, maybe it depends on policies, on integrating these minorities, or maybe it depends on the timing of state formation. Many of these, I mean, I would assume that it would be a timing issue if you have the creation of the state before nationalism, for example. That would make a difference. Anyway, that was on. So what is the problem? And then war. Maybe you can clarify, what do you mean by war? Because irredentism, at least in Italy, is associated with not so much with war, but with terrorism. So terrorist groups that wage various types of attacks. Would that count as war? Would that go too far? Probably yes, but maybe you can clarify. Thank you.
Sure. Well, first of all, this is a structuralist approach where we're not measuring the emergence of nationalism as a movement. We're not measuring the nationality, the approach to nationalities by the state itself. So it goes without saying, and we talk a little bit about this, but perhaps not enough, that many things would have to happen along the line. And the strength of the research design and the structural approach is that it's a dragnet. We have Ticino is in there, so we can say, look at the all in all, other things being equal, what is the likelihood that we get conflict in these configurations? And this changes, no doubt, over time. And we've already started speculating about how, for instance, interstate disputes probably became much less likely because of international norms in the course of the 20th century, especially after World War II. But the same thing applies to the way that minorities are handled by governments. So the Ticino story cannot be explained without looking at power sharing and federalism, obviously. And there are possibilities that we could say go beyond what we do here, but we think that the paper is probably doing enough for the time being. But we should say, at least we should say more about these deviations or all these non-barking or non-biting dogs, to use Beisinger's metaphor. So that's when it comes to the very definition. Then, by the way, nationality problem is taken from German nationality. It's problem by and large, but it's really about the lack of congruence, violations of the nationality problem, the nationality principle. Now, when it comes to the war / conflict dependent variable, we're switching back and forth a little bit here between conflict and war, which is not super precise, but we should probably say something about that also in the paper. But we do not include one-sided violence, including terrorism. So conflict requires that there are two sides, that both sides fight. So one-sided violence, according to typical categories that we use in conflict research, conflict would exclude one-sided violence like terrorism and mass killings, ethnic cleansing, etc. But it's clear that we would expect that those tendencies, those types of political violence would also show up, and they are even predicted by Myron Weiner in his syndrome. So it's highly relevant, but we have to limit ourselves. We think we have enough. we did enough coding in this paper but we do have another paper in our overall project where we're looking at ethnic cleansing as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Lars-Erik. Jelena Dankic.
Hi, hello. Let me just figure out how to take my hand down. Okay. So thank you very much. This is a fascinating research. Just to follow up on Daniela's question and also on some of Daniel's points in the chat, I think that one thing that I would like to hear a little bit more from you about are the various contestations, also of all the terms that you're using, right? So you do a historical analysis of terminology. And when I kind of looked at the title of this paper and the presentation, it says the Macedonian Syndrome, right? And I was like, okay, which Macedonian, right? So the meaning of ethnic groups and communities perhaps has changed. And I was wondering whether and how you took account of that in your research. My second question was also related to something that Daniel mentioned in his comments, and that's to what extent can we actually differentiate between civil wars and intrastate wars? And I think that there has been a lot of work in IR, as you probably know, on the differences, but also if you think about the conflicts in the former Yugoslavia, there is a great contestation as to what extent some of them and in which time periods were civil wars and in which they were intrastate wars. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. I mean, these are very good questions, and also following up on what other people have said so far. I mean, I think that I want to be absolutely open about this limitation here. The paper does not try to start engaging some kind of sophisticated social movement analysis. And we have data collection that is going on in a different part of our project where we're trying to come up with data on this. It's very difficult and much more time consuming, of course, so we're not done with that. So this is a structural approach that is to say, bridging over all sorts of things that have been happening. So we're not necessarily saying that the meaning of politicized ethnicity in the mid-19th century is exactly the same as the meaning of the same thing in, say, the early 21st century. We're agnostic, we're structuralist, we just throw it into our models. We should be more explicit in the discussion, interpreting the results and coming up with caveats and speculating about how these effects may actually differ, depending on the way that these figures have been mobilizing, the way that ethnicity has been understood in different parts of the world and during different periods. So when we start to go beyond Europe and get into Africa, for instance, it would be ludicrous to think that this is exactly like the Balkans. But that was essentially, we're just following the thought experiment that Myron Weiner launched into. I think it's still useful as a starting point, not, as long as one is aware of the contextual differences that may be there, and we should talk more about this, obviously. I still think it's defensible as a thought experiment to see how far you can go with this, how far this is analytically helpful. And indeed, what Myron Weiner claimed already in 1971 was that since the development literature tends to bracket the whole interstate dynamic and the regional context, and it's still to a large extent true, in fact, to get into this exercise is really useful to open up the black box of the state. Now, when it comes to the differences between civil and interstate conflict, you're definitely right that in some cases where the very notion of what it means to be a unit and where inside becomes outside, there is a period where the two are, so they blend into each other. In fact, it's not like, the fighter who has been fighting a civil war inside Yugoslavia and now starts to fight Croatia, newly independent Croatia, for instance, is a completely different person and is a completely different conflict, etc. So there are gray zones very clearly, that we're just using the conventional definitions in the quantitative statistical literature and applying them. And more should be said, I think, also about the difficulties of separating the two in some of these cases. I mean, there is also, that's also where we try to pick up activities that fall into the other category in this two-level interaction. So at least we would be able to account for previous interactions that would be classified as civil war inside an analysis of disputes. The previous literature, for instance, when it comes to so-called enduring rivalries, has been completely segregated in the sense that enduring rivalries, these long-term processes, were first defined in interstate terms only, and with no reference to civil war at all. And then there were some people who say, oh, but hey, we have enduring rivalries at the level of civil wars as well. But still, those people, they didn't look at the disputes. So at least what we can do here is that we should say, look at how these types influence each other. And that at least bridges some of these artificial divides. But we may be able to go beyond that. But thanks a lot.
Thank you, Lars-Erik. Am I correct? There are no hands raised at the moment. There is a question in the chat by Daniel Boxler, and Jelena referred to it. It's not very clear. I don't know if you see it, Lars-Erik, if you go in the chat.
I'd be happy to look at the chat, but is Daniel not able to put the question
He seems
himself?
to have some unstable connection.
Oh, that's too bad.
But maybe I see he's unmuting. Wait, let's wait a second.
I mean, I can try. Actually,
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Okay. So just one point which hasn't been raised yet. Lars-Erik, you quite excellent kind of paper, very important for several literatures. Now you keep kind of coming back both in the presentation and in the paper quite prominently to Russia and what Russia is currently doing in Ukraine. And what I was kind of pointing to in the chat was that that's quite a similar pattern as what we have already experienced in Georgia and Abkhazia and in Transnistria. And I'm really wondering, I mean, the Abkhaz, they are not ethnic Russians. Is this about ethnicity? Or is this about a regional influence zone and kind of creating alliances and potential changes of alliances? You might say that's not important for the analysis in the paper, but because the case is so prominent, I still wanted to ask the question. The other questions have already been raised.
Okay, well, here, of course, is the question of how you handle something like, how you handle a category like the Russian speakers inside Ukraine. And if you want to push this from a completely constructivist standpoint, you could follow Putin's own analysis of the whole thing from last summer, where he says that the Ukrainians are actually Russians anyway. So that would go very far in that direction. I think there is a difference to the Abkhazians in the sense that they, from what I know about them, is that they are not really ethnically Russians, ethnically speaking Russians. However, the Russian speakers in Ukraine are to a large extent self-identifying with Russia. Not all of them. There are many Russian speakers inside Ukraine who even side with the Western push. I mean, I just read a paper about an entrepreneur, ethnic Russian entrepreneur, who says that my home is Ukraine, but he's ethnically Russian. So what we're doing here is that we're just using the ethnic, in a cruder sense, these ethnic categorizations, and then obviously there are much more, to say, nuanced cases. I think in this case it's still helpful, but area experts would have to tell us if it's not.
I have no objection whatsoever about the coding of the group. My question is more about how you qualitatively deal with kind of, this set of wars, and that you seem to interpret them as ethnic wars.
That is the structural, I mean, we have actually looked at the civil conflicts in terms of the claims and the participation. So the civil conflicts are, to say, not just a grab bag when it comes to the interstate level. Let me see now, Yannick, if we go to the claims, for instance, the territorial claims and the MIDs, how far the data sets are actually allowing us to go beyond just a structural fit.
What do you mean by going beyond the structural fit?
Well, the question here is to say, if you have a dispute between two countries and you have the right type of configuration, the question is, of course, how closely the actual motivation of that dispute and those claims will be falling in there, aligning themselves with this logic that we are postulating.
I mean, from the data itself, it's difficult. I mean, by looking at the cases, you can get a clearer picture. And I think that's what we need to do with this paper, to discuss a couple of real world cases and trace the process to see whether it was actually framed, at least in these irredentist and ethno-nationalist kin terms. And maybe relating to a question that came before, moving beyond the dyadic setting could actually be an option, because for the MIDs we have geocodes for the first instance of hostilities. So we could test whether it happens actually on the grounds of the specific ethnic segments we're looking at. And we have done geocoding ourselves of the specific regions that are claimed in territorial claims. So we could also check whether the territorial claim actually affects a specific target segment that has links to the revisionist state, or as opposed to any other piece of territory or strategic points in the other country.
Yeah, that obviously would help to narrow the gap, not entirely to close it. But it's clear that, I mean, we've already started looking at the hit list of the onsets that that show up in our models, and by first inspection and going through these cases is not surprising at all. I mean, this looks very much in line with what you would expect. But again, the question is how far we are going to be able to go with this. We will certainly have to do more systematic scanning through the cases. And then using this geographic information may also be helpful to narrow the gap. But there is a structural gap for sure. So the chat seems to be quite active here.
Yes, but yeah, I'm not very good at dealing with the chat, so
neither
I'll look at it. We still have a bit of time if someone would like to intervene, or yes, mention what's written in the chat. This does not seem to be the case. It's a bit before 2 p.m., but there is no reason not to.
We've got fantastic feedback, and this is
well, yes. Yeah, no, I mean, great papers always get great feedback. I mean, it's something that goes hand in hand. So thank you very much, Lars-Erik, but also Yannick and Dennis, who's here with us as well. It was a very stimulating, engaging session, and good luck with the project. And thank you everyone for attending. And we meet again on February 23rd. This is next week, same time, 12:30, but we will be in Sala Europa if everything goes according to plan, in hybrid mode. And it will be a seminar of the Europe in the World series with Christian Kreuter-Sommer, and with a talk on authority transfer from and to international organizations. So I hope to see many of you again for another interesting session. Until then, have a good week, stay safe. All the best also to Niklas, Lars-Erik, and
it's
everyone
almost fine now. Well, thanks a lot again for, it was great to be there virtually, and next time I'll be there in person.
We look forward to that.
Good.
Thank you again. Thank you everyone, and goodbye.